It is about 1 minute until midday. Today is Friday. Throughout this week, we have discussed domestic violence, and it is a very prevalent matter in these United States. Locally, it is a major problem, and it is a major problem even in social as well as political circles. Because of that, I don't think we can talk too much about the impact of domestic violence or domestic abuse when it comes to even Christians, God fearing people. Next week, we're actually going to spend the entire week addressing mental awareness, mental health, because in the midst of this COVID-19 pandemic, a lot of people are struggling with mental health issues, whether those are social, whether those are emotional, relational, school. Mental health issues are really on the rise during this COVID-19 pandemic. And that will be our focus for the entirety of next week. So we will invite you to please join us for the duration of next week's lessons as we focus on mental health. Today, let's conclude our series on domestic abuse or domestic violence. As I promised on yesterday, today we will talk about the results of abuse upon the victim. Injuries, minor to severe, are highly likely. Stress related illnesses, long term disabilities, unwanted pregnancies, lost work time, actually unemployment. People can get fired because of perpetual harassment by the abuser. Some abusers will go as far as sabotaging the workplace of that person that is being abused. Poverty can result as a result of being abused. Loss of children. I mean, not just the loss of children in terms of being taken away by the abusive parent, but the loss of a child through death. Harm to the child can be done. Parenting complications can take place. Post-traumatic stress can set in. A person can go into deep depression to where dealing with the abuse will actually take all of the energy out of them. And to compensate for that, sometimes people will actually start using substance abuse, drugs, alcohol. We call that self medication. But basically, what people are trying to do is to compensate for the pain that they're actually experiencing because of the domestic abuse. And God forbid, one of the results of abuse upon the victim is actually death. About 1/3 of the female murder victims each year are killed by an intimate partner, compared to 3 to 4% of male victims. Uh, so the death rate among females because of domestic violence, domestic abuse, you're talking about 33% of the female murders that takes place in this country every year is traced back to a domestic situation. Uh, when I'm in the gym in the afternoon, I've shared this before. One of the shows that I look at, or maybe the show is looking at me, is Fatal Attractions. Uh, in that show, every day they're trying to solve a murder mystery, of a relationship murder. It's not an armed robbery. It's not a car accident of such. But in that show, Fatal Attractions, they are trying to figure out who killed this person. And almost 100% of the shows are based upon relationship murders. And with the 100% base being relationship murders, about, I'd say 35, 40%, I'll take that back. Probably about 75% of the shows centers around females who've been murdered. And they're trying to figure out who killed this lady. But it's always traceable back to some type domestic violence situation. You notice I've got the 1-800 number posted at the top of each screen, because there are some mental and physical impacts of domestic abuse. Look at the bold letters, and I won't go through everything on the slide, but notice the bold captions. Women abused by their intimate partners are more vulnerable to contracting HIV or other STDs due to forced intercourse or prolonged exposure to stress. Some will raise the question, well, what does HIV or STDs have to do with domestic violence? It's been found that a lot of individuals, women who are victims of domestic violence, the abuser is also involved in outside relationships. And because of the outside relationships, the promiscuity, that abusive person will bring into that home STDs and drug use, HIV situations, and the person who is in the home, the restricted environment, the threatened environment, is basically forced into intimate acts with the individual, for fear of being beaten, for fear of being financially depraved, threatened. So basically what they're doing is complying. But in the process of compliance, they are also contracting HIV and other STDs. And then notice at the bottom, victims of domestic violence are also at higher risk for developing addictions to alcohol, tobacco, or drugs. Why? Well, they're trying to escape the pain. They're numbing themselves. Many times they're numbing themselves to the abuse. That if I'm intoxicated, if I drink or use drugs or tobacco is a sedative, then it won't bother me as much mentally. It's a coping tool, but it is a very, very harmful way to cope with domestic abuse. And everything else in the slide is very, very germane. Physical, mental, sexual, reproductive health is even impacted. How many times have you heard stories of a lady being impregnated, but yet she loses the baby because the person is abusing her or beating her, or she's using drugs or alcohol to numb the pain. So miscarriages, stillbirths, unwanted pregnancies, because some abusive men in their distorted thinking believes that if I can keep her pregnant, then she will not go anywhere, because who wants to take a pregnant woman? So all types of things happen as a result of this domestic violence. Here's a caveat to intervention. Victims really need domestic violence services, a safety plan, orders of protection, and support. Victims should not have to deal with their partner's domestic abuse all by themselves. Uh, Family support, friend support. Uh, where do people spend the majority of their daylight hours? In a work environment. But in the work environment, it is the place where people honestly many times know the person's behaviors best. They know when they're having a good day, they know when they're having a bad day. And yet, many times, the person who's being abused, uh, when approached by a work colleague, and typically the work colleague is very discreet in what they say, so they'll ask a very vague question. Are you okay? Is there anything that you like to talk about? What they're really trying to do in that work environment is say, there's something going on, but I don't want to be accusatory. I don't want it to appear as if I'm trying to delve into your private life. But imagine working with a person for 3, 4, 5, 10 years, 8 to 10 hours a day. You can kind of tell when something is going awry. But the victims of the domestic violence, they need that extended service. They need to know that somebody is there for them. They need to know what the resources are, whether, how do we file a complaint? Uh, who do I go to with the complaint? Because sometimes the disappointment can set in depending on who answers the call. You call 911 as the abused person, and the last thing you want is to be abused by the police who come to help. Now, I'm going to move through some slides, but all of the slides that I'm going to move through deals with police intervention and the laws. I'm not going to prolong these, but there are a lot of regulations that empowers the police department and sometimes restrict what police can and cannot do. But what we know is, depending on who the police woman or policeman is that answers the call, is going to dictate how the police handle the call. That's why I am a strong proponent of community policing, to where the community knows who the police officers are. The police officers have a good feel of who the community is. Just recently in Prince George's County, where we reside, the police chief resigned, abruptly, I might say. But the county executive actually sent out a questionnaire inquiring about what are some of the things you like to see in the process of replacing the police chief. And one of the things that I put into the inquiry was the need for the police, not only the police chief, but for the police that's patrolling a community, honestly, to know the community. It's not just a job. Uh, who lives in the community? Do the police have a vested interest in the communities, in the county? Or do they live in surrounding counties? Prince George's County is surrounded by multiple jurisdictions, whether we're looking at Charles County, Anne Arundel County, Howard County, Montgomery County, the District of Columbia, Northern Virginia. But the great question that we should raise, the police who are supposed to protect and serve us, do you see them at public events? Do you see them at school functions, local churches, local social events, local sporting events? Or do we just honestly see them on a shift driving with their patrol cars, their windows up, and they have no idea about the dynamics of the community, the people? So when you have a domestic violence call, they're more concerned about their safety many times than they are about what's really going on in this house that I'm called to. Uh, One of the things that law enforcement officers are not to do, if you look at the bottom of the screen, when responding to a domestic incident, law enforcement officers shall not threaten, suggest, or otherwise indicate the possible arrest of all parties to discourage requests for intervention by law enforcement by any party. In other words, I tell you what, if you guys can't work this out, I'll just arrest everybody. And we'll call social services and they'll come pick up the children and you'll lose your children. You're going to lose that's not the job of police. Police are supposed to come in and honestly assess the situation and do a fair assessment of the situation. Now, if you look back at the top of the screen, this is the way an officer is supposed to make a best effort attempt to sort through this. Look for the fear factor. Who is talking and acting scared? Look at the body language. Who displays the aggressive stand? Consider the physical size of the parties as a factor, though not the only one. Look at the history of abuse. Look at consider past medical records, 911 tapes, police report, shelter stays, orders of protection. Uh, Look at the paper trail, neighbors and witnesses. Consider prior and typical behavior, but you see how there has to be an awareness of the community you serve. Uh, so when police are called, if the police are not aware of the community that they are serving, they can actually do more harm than good. And people who are being abused will say, I just rather for the police not to be involved because they're not going to do a fair assessment of what is going on. Uh, let's recap everything that we've talked about for the week. Uh, why a person abuse another person? Why would anybody even do that? People often speak of domestic abuse as a choice, but in reality, abusers make many choices over a long period of time. Choices that stem from the belief that abusive behavior is a legitimate way to create and maintain their rightful position of power and privilege within the family, that they are entitled to act as they do. They consciously think that way. Domestic abusers who have non-domestic criminal histories also think using violence is legitimate in other contexts. In other words, people who have been saturated, exposed, rooted in violence figure that's how I get life done. At its root, domestic abuse is motivated by desire. Remember the abuse wheel that I showed you? It's motivated by desire to gain and to keep control. More and more now is coming out about the previous president, 45, and how it was a power play, lying, intimidating, pulling people into his craziness. It was all a ploy to control other people. But underneath it all was a very inferior person. Uh, and that's typically going to be across the board with people who are abusive. Uh, Let me see. Yeah, this is slide 23. So, what can we predict about abusive people? What's the prognosis? It's not good. Because domestic abuse is largely driven by attitudes and social inequality, therapeutic efforts to stop it are largely unsuccessful. And I can truly tell you that uh, from a professional in clinical psychology. My success rate in intervening with people who are dead set on control and power, my success rate is almost zero. Because in order for people to change, they have to surrender power and control. And they're not about to do that. Mental health and substance abuse treatment cannot effectively address either abusers' belief that they have the right to use violence to get what they want, or the social inequality that supports those beliefs. Yet, abusers, especially those who have mental health problems, are often sent to some sort of mental health treatment, either individually or in a battering program. Uh, and most of the time, it doesn't work because the abuser is saying, I just don't understand why people abuse me. They become the victim and they begin to make excuses for their behavior. I mean, what did you expect for me to do? What did you expect for me to say? Uh, so rarely, I'm not saying it cannot happen, but I am saying rarely will a person who is set on abusing another person, will they relinquish that mentality? Many of the social underpinnings, and this is the last slide, many of the social underpinnings of domestic abuse, such as male dominance, can't be treated at all, as they are not the sort of individual problems that clinicians work on. For instance, you can't treat a man's belief that he owns his partner and is entitled to run her life. People keep saying, but that's just the way it is. That's what a woman is supposed to be. A man is supposed to do. This is how it is supposed. And when people have reached that conclusion, they will frustrate you in trying to change their mind about it. The fact that someone sees their partner as an object, it's hard to fix that. Because what we have learned is that the person before us who makes that claim is not the first person in that family system who's made that claim. So the reason people will hold on to some of these idiotic and ungodly and unhealthy positions is because if they let go of them, then they're defying the family history. They're basically saying, my family fed me a lot of untruths. So rather than acknowledge their family was off base, they will keep the position of the family in order to keep the family intact. Entitlement attitudes are very hard to change, especially ones that are long-standing and culturally supported, and that benefit the individual who holds them. Treatment providers can and should challenge these beliefs, but they are not just matters of individual motivation or pathology. In other words, this is traceable into a family lineage. And the best we can do is push back on it. And the best that others can do, instead of enabling it, is to say, this is wrong. I mean, from church people to the community, to friends, they must pull back and say to the abuser, your behavior is completely inappropriate. So you alienate the abuser instead of allowing the abuser to alienate the abused person. Because as long as you can keep the abused person in isolation, the abuser basically has free reign over them. Next week, as I said, we're going to spend the entire week addressing mental health, mental illness, especially in light of this COVID-19 pandemic. More and more is being said in the media about the impact that the social distancing, the inability of children to go to school, the inability of adults to freely be around family, to freely travel, that it's really having a mental impact on individuals. And to a large degree, that's true, especially over a protracted amount of time. So next week, we're going to spend the entire week looking at mental health, especially in light of this COVID-19 pandemic. Thank you for staying with me this week. I see you got your camera up and running. Is that the camera? Is that working for you?
Thank you so much. Yes.
Right. It looks good.
Thank you.
Good and clear. Okay. Let's have a closing prayer and then we will dismiss. Father, we thank you for the week. And I just pray that as we've talked about domestic violence, domestic abuse, that it has helped those who have tuned in to be able to help others. And I pray, Father, that the persons or people who might be the recipients of abuse, I pray that they will take courage to know that there are people who are on their side and people who are there for them. And I just pray they will have the courage to reach out and allow others to help navigate them away from the abusers. Keep us safe, and I pray for our members who are sick, that you'll keep them safe as well. Through Jesus, I pray. Amen. Okay, thank you for tuning in this week. The snowstorm is on the way, so I've heard. So there's a high likelihood that everything is going to be remote on Sunday. But early Sunday morning, I will send out an email after we take an assessment. But based on the weather forecasting, it looks pretty likely that we will not assemble at the building on Sunday, just for safety purposes.
All right.
Okay. All right. God bless.
All right.